Again, a nice roll up already, nice and early. So we have some questions that have been submitted in. Are you guys happy to do those that have come in by email first, and then we'll answer any questions from the floor?
Please.
Okay, great. Let's get that done then. I need to share. Filled that problem out. And Peter, by the way, I think I found the very original source problem, so hopefully we'll have that sorted out by next time round.
Okay.
Which is great news.
Hmm.
Okay, you should be able to see an email there from Andy.
Yes.
Is it coming up? Yes, it is.
Yeah, from Graham.
Sorry, from Graham? Yeah.
Yeah, Andy's just replied to it, that's all.
Okay, sorry. So here we have what could be a inverted commas scar tree. And so the question is, what have we actually got? What are we looking at? And so we go to the 4 requirements for what makes a scar tree or a culturally modified tree. First of all, the tree's got to be old enough. What have we got here? Lemon-scented gum looks to it, Crimbia citriodora, maybe?
I don't think we've got Graham yet.
Yeah, okay. So it looks like a Crimbia. That's my gut level guess. Maybe maculata.
Yes, I think Graham's here. Are you here, Graham?
Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead on that.
Yeah,
Graham, Crimbia maculata?
No, it's an Angophora
costata. Angophora costata, thank you very much. Is it in the Byron end of the world? Where is it?
It's Charlestown near Lake Macquarie.
Okay, Newcastle end of the world.
Yeah, Newcastle, near Newcastle. It's on the side of the road, obviously.
Yeah.
Someone deliberately and purposefully took that bark off it about 6 months ago, maybe a year ago.
So someone's done it as a modern or new cultural modification?
Yeah, I don't know who did it or why, but it looks like it was done with purpose.
Yeah, okay, and it quite possibly could be. Interesting now that we've got a wound to the tree. What do we do about this?
Yeah, that was the question I posed, and I was wondering, you see those shoots coming from the base, whether you could bend those across and graft them in at the sides or the top of the callus.
You could, but then you end up with complications later on. My gut level feeling is Angophora's moderately decay resistance, reasonably durable timber, not great, but it's not bad. And it will tolerate a large amount of decay. You see massive big cavities in Angophoras fairly regularly. My gut level feeling is give it time to occlude over, and I suspect that in a matter of probably, 20 or 30 years, that will occlude over. You'll end up, but that looks like an older wound than just 6 months or so. It does look like it's very deliberate. It could be impact. I'm not going to rule that out. It'd be interesting to look at it a little closer. But what we know is it's not a culturally modified tree. And the reason why we know is, first of all, that is not a big Angophora. I, in my youth, made a horrible mistake of doing a job for a council that had me fill out an Angophora costata I could stand up inside the hollow of. So I'm confident that that's not old. Maybe 80, maybe 100, possibly as young as 40 or 50. And the wound margins here are quite thin. So this is not a 1,000-year-old tree with a 200-year-old wound. That wound wood has got to be proportionate to the trunk diameter. So, in fact, that wound wood will be slightly faster growing than the ordinary tissue because it's not in ring tension anymore. So wound margins tend to grow faster, and you see that lumpiness on the side. So we can eliminate this as being a culturally modified tree other than a modern cultural modification, and it could be. But that does look to me, this amount of woundwood at the top here and the side suggests maybe 4 or 5 years. Have you tried, Graham, to go down to Street View and have a look at it historically?
Yeah, no, but I do have some old photos of when it was first done. I just couldn't find them, so they're somewhere in the collection.
So how long ago was that, do you think?
Yeah, it's less than 2 years, I would think.
Okay, so it's growing at a relatively fast rate. So that gives a whole lot of information. Now, I would be inclined to want to dispense with the lower basis suckers, if anything, because they're at a fairly tight angle, and they're going to have a hard job getting a good point of attachment. And so I think a good final cut would probably serve the tree better in the long run.
Yeah, and with
I
the
might give it another couple of years. Sorry, what was that, Graham?
You notice that with the callousing around the wound, you can't really see in the photographs, but at the base of the cut, the callus hasn't formed. In fact, the bark has died at the base, going down into one of the roots.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's died back down there. Hasn't got any callus there.
Yeah, and that's because the vascular tissue has to realign itself to go around, and it's really inefficient to come up here and then suddenly turn. So what it's doing is it's coming up here and it's turning gradually. And so if you clean this out with a little bit of care, and I'm not saying you should, it'll deal with itself fairly soon, you'll probably find it comes down to somewhere around about here.
Mark, do you want to make a comment on the use of the term callus?
Yeah, okay, I will do. So you use the word callousing over, and callus is only probably in most cases less than 1 millimeter thick, and after that it becomes wound wood. So callus is the first tissue, and it's different from ordinary wood in that it's not differentiated. That is, it's just lots of parenchyma, one after another. Whereas wound wood has the rays and the vessels back into it. And so at this point, this is wound wood. And whilst we used to call this callousing over, again, it's just about this precision of communication. We would now say that's occluding or covering over rather than callousing. And it's just a minor technicality that, it's like we say, oh, look, I know this Friday night, some TV personality will say about the gardening thing, oh, look, it's time to feed your trees, or it's time to feed this. No, sunlight feeds. We're just giving some solutes, some chemicals that the tree is going to use over and above what its food is. But its food is actually carbon dioxide and sunlight, the two together. So yes, that's a great example of the things that we need to look at. I know it's not a endemic scar tree regardless, because it doesn't pass another one of the tests, and that test is it's got to be something that was of use by the community. Now, I can't tell because there's not a sense of scale, but I get a sense of it from here. That's probably 3 foot from top to bottom, maybe a bit more.
Yeah, that's about right, about 1 meter.
That's a big Coolamon. Okay, that's a 2, maybe a 3-person Coolamon. There's just no logic to that. A shield, it's just way too big for a shield. It's too heavy for a shield, so it doesn't match up with anything that would be used culturally by the First Nation people. So it doesn't fit in. Oh, we do have a couple of extra images. And yeah, it does look like it's a modern, culturally modified tree. And again, if you haven't found it, go find the article, The Disappearing Goanna, and you'll find that the disappearing goanna has now disappeared. And that's about 40 years after it was cut into a Camargulensis, and a not too dissimilar size, but a bigger diameter trunk tree when it started. So this is looks almost 50% of the circumference. And what will eventually happen is that woundwood here will start to come in from the sides, Once that's gone past 1/3 of the circumference, then the tree's back to being just an average tree. And we've got another mentor on. I just see a wise old face there. Kyle Hill has joined us. Kyle is, I think, Kyle, you predate my full-time working career in arboriculture. You've been longer than I have.
I thought I was a young fella.
Any comments to add into that,
I
Kyle?
actually joined at the end of the conversation there, or halfway through. Sorry, I didn't get on at 6:30 on the dot. I just like to ask a comment about the wound that's forming around the edges of that, and based on differences in thickness at the top and the bottom at the sides, can that be gauged as an indicator of general tree health?
Yes, absolutely. So the rate at which a tree responds to injury, its reaction rate's a very important indicator. This is very thick up here for a slightly different reason, I suspect. I suspect that we're getting a little bit of problem with translocating back down the other way as well. There's some congestion at the top here. And so what the message the tree's getting is, look, we're getting all the sugar down the bottom that we can get down the bottom. So let's do the next smart thing and let's start putting on new tissue. It's exactly the same as you get if you ring barked a tree. You'll get the area above the ring bark will often thicken out quite rapidly as it turns the excess carbohydrates into increased stem storage. So I suspect that's what's happening up here. But this is still good growth rate. So, I mean, my view is this is a healthy tree that we'd be quite happy to have deal with. Andy, you've got a question? Go for it. Mike's off.
I'm sorry. One of the people that I studied under was Phil Hadlington in Sydney Forestry Commission in about 1980s, and he taught us that when we had a wound like this, we would try to clean it up to the extent possible where there wasn't flaking bark. But he also advocated to stimulate the vertical sides of the wound with like a paint scraper, which back lightly to the cambium. And I know a lot of these treatments that were advocated in those days have now been thrown out as junk. But I've done that like 10 years ago on a Citriodora and found that it fully compartmentalized or occluded the wound. You can't, no trace of it now. So I just wonder if there's any basis in that stimulating the cambial tissue by lightly scraping.
I can't answer definitively, but my understanding of anatomy says I seriously suspect not. I think what you have is some plant material that occurs incredibly quickly, and Citriodora immaculata, good examples. Those of you who are in Sydney, if you go down to Parramatta Park, you'll see what it looks like to see 50-year-old Citriodoras that are more than 600-700 mils in diameter. So very fast-growing species. To do that and demonstrate that, you'd need an experiment, and the experiment would run something like this. We'll pick 20 trees. We'll wound all 20 of them. We'll let them start to occlude. We'll wound them on different sides and at different spots, randomly selected, coins and dices and those sort of things to get to where you need to be. And then once they start to grow back, then compare rewounding versus not rewounding. But wounding a tree is not desirable. So trying to minimize that wounding just sits in my head as being an appropriate option. When you wound a tree like this tree here, all of the storage is gone. And right back to the edge of that margin, it's done the same thing. It's where it starts to produce callus, everything inwards of the callus is made dysfunctional and dead. So we turn it into heartwood. And, Citriodora or Angophora or maculata, you could have, 40 or 50 mils or more of sapwood. So I'm not so sure. David's made a comment. Also look up, what was the rest of that comment, David? Do you want to join us verbally?
Yeah, there's a guy here in Victoria, Mick Harding, calls himself the Dancing Wombat, who's been scarring trees over the last few years all around Victoria, and yeah, for art. So just something interesting, I guess.
Look, there's a Wiradjuri man that's doing the same, and I think understanding and seeing it is really useful. In Victoria, you've got it at Coburn, beside the river there. There's some modern dendroglyphs, again out of culture, because the indigenous community there didn't do dendroglyphs, but they've done dendroglyphs, and you can see that again they're almost occluded, and that's 20-something rather years. So it does give us that sense of understanding of things. And I know that I find it so difficult to age trees and age tree parts and age what the tree is doing, unless you can actually get to do things like cut them down, or you can find aerial images. And a few years back, I gave a paper on this, and we looked at a tree at Parramatta Park that was identified as a scar tree, and we got radiocarbon dating done on the wound face, and it was a 1950s wound. So it's very modern, 70 years. For Parramatta, that's 140 years younger than it needed to be. And the author thought the tree was about 400 years old just because of the injuries and how slow it seemed to be growing. But in fact, as I said, the tree was probably only about 90 to 100 years of age. So I think we as a profession, we do this thing about useful life expectancy. How much longer has this tree got? And I think I've mentioned before, Craig Hinton gave a really interesting paper on this and said it was the most unreliable piece of information they recorded when they did data sets, because you'd look at the tree and you say, oh, it's not growing too well, it's not doing too well, and 2 years later it'd be thriving, and a tree that you said was doing really well was dead. So we're not efficient at doing that, and we don't have enough data. We need a lot of data to start getting an idea about how long trees are likely to go, and based on some form of formal analysis. So here, doing an IKI test would be really a useful thing to get an idea on how the tree's going. What would be really good, those of you who are managing it, would be doing finding some smaller roots, around the other side, some smaller roots around the front side, and doing a starch analysis to see whether the roots on the wound side are performing as well as the roots on the other side. I suspect they will be, or be close to it. But again, it'd be interesting information to have.
So what are we doing with an IKI test, Mark?
With an IKI test, we're looking for starch reserves. So the currency that plants trade in, the whole life is about sugars. They're carb freaks. And so they store a lot of their excess carbohydrates as starch. It's a very efficient form of storage of a sugar because it's got no water. It's water insoluble unless you heat it. So it allows them to store.
You're going to paint a sample with iodine and see how much starch is in the sample. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. Let me pull you up. Yeah, I think I can do one. Oh, I've just switched you off, haven't I?
Yep.
Yeah, that's okay. Serves me right. Not the brightest boy, I can tell you. That's a real worry, isn't it? Entire screen, yes. Share. At least we've got this bit down pat now, Peter. So if we look at I don't know that I've got an iodine stain marked up, but I'll just check quickly. Otherwise, we'll just pull a general image off the internet. No. Starch. And you can do this with a potato. Potatoes are really great, or paper. So starch iodine test, you can see the blackening here. Here we go, wood. Oh, there we are. There's one on potato. It's not perfect, but it gives you the idea. Let me move that across. Here, the starch is turning dark colored, and the same thing happens with your living cells. Most living cells. Oh, hang on. Here's one with wood. No, it's not. But it's still, you're seeing the starch stain up darker color, and so our living cells stain up black. And the healthier they are, the healthier the tree is, the more black that it has. Okay, so it's a nice, simple process. Very useful diagnostically, particularly if we've got some form of benchmark. And if you go back, I'm pretty sure in one of the earlier versions of Trees, Insects, Pests and Soils, Peter, we did look at IKI staining via a PowerPoint. Is that correct?
I don't recall.
Don't recall? Okay, I might be wrong. If we haven't, guys, let me know if you'd like me to go through that. I'm happy to go through that. It's a fairly easy, simple, inexpensive test process. A box knife or a Stanley knife, $20 of or $30 worth of chemicals, and a small digital microscope or a good digital phone camera, and you can get some interesting results fairly quickly and easily. So that's the IKI issue. IKI, iodine and potassium iodide. Iodine, did I close down my... I did. So there's a problem of working off two screens at the same time. Iodine doesn't dissolve in water. So you can make iodine for testing in two ways. One's tincture, and tincture's okay, except it adds alcohol, and alcohol has some interesting side effects with other things. So another way of doing it is to make a potassium iodide solution, and then you can dissolve iodine in potassium iodide, and that's the preferred reaction. Sold online as Mueller's reagent or Lugol's solution. Fairly common, not a difficult thing at all to get a hold of. And it does denature, which means you need to keep it in a dark spot and preferably not hot. So our excess stuff, likes to sit in the fridge. That's a perfect spot for it, in opaque bottles. In the early days, we used to wrap them with tape so that they were opaque, but nowadays you can buy just really neat quality opaque bottles to do the job with. Hopefully that didn't crash us out. No, it didn't. That's good. Okay, so excellent questions. Any more questions about that, or anything anyone else want to ask? Any more questions about that?
About the tree? Yeah, I've got one more about the tree, that wound. It's not very obvious in the photographs, but the timber that's been exposed is drying and cracking. And they do say these days not to put paint on, but that's facing northwest, so it's getting the full sun on it and it's dried out all that timber. And I was wondering if it would have been better to paint it so that it could heal over soundwood rather than decay set in before the wound is healed over.
Good question. Resist everything except temptation. No, don't paint it. The results from Shigo's work clearly showed that on small wounds, painting was of no real benefit. On very small wounds, it might have been of benefit, but then they were never the problem. And on big wounds, painting was always adverse. So not to paint is the answer. If he had done this intentionally, one of the things that he could have done is treated this with lanolin or arbor balm and had the wound face grow back, and that's really interesting to see. But again, ever who's doing it is obviously not so much concerned about that. Dominic, you've got a question? Mute your microphone, please. There.
Yeah, sorry, I'll just come back to it. Just on your comment there with the painting. So I've heard through conversations that painting was common back in the 70s and the 80s. And you mentioned on a large wound, it will have adverse effects for the tree. What are those adverse effects?
Good. Well, I think we've got to go back to a little bit of cell stuff to start off with. Living cells are really good at resisting decay. And when the tree is wrapped around by a group of living cells, we don't get a lot of decay except through the middle of things that are exposed. So, cut branches, broken branches, older trunks where the trees started to occlude out some of the earlier sinker roots or the radical. You can get low oxygen preferring species or heartwood species come up from the ground of decay. When you paint with a paint dressing, it's not sterile and you can't get the paint off. So what you put on is a layer that helps the wood stay moist. In fact, getting it to dry out is exactly what we want. Okay. So what we don't want to do here is paint it and then leave the paint on. Now, yeah, in theory, like a Band-Aid, if you had a paint on, then it's not going to have a problem. But now if I cut my arm off and I stick a whole pile of Band-Aids over the end of it and it's not sterile, you'll just keep on cutting the rest of the arm off and then put me in a box and bury me. And it's the same with the tree. It really doesn't want to hold that moisture in. In fact, that lack of moisture holding it in starts to slow down the rate of decay.
Yeah.
So just like think a Band-Aid, if I could put a Band-Aid on and take it off 6 months later, that's fine. But this is not a sterile surface at all. Even if you did it straight away, we're not in a sterile environment. So we're already having issues. The other thing is Lynn Bodie out of the UK, Professor Lynn Bodie, showed that a lot of our decay fungi are actually epiphytes. They're in there already, acting as endophytes or living inside the tree. And so we're not really going to stop that. What happens is, as our cells start to dry out, those little fissures and cracks start coming in, that allows the cells behind to die and so on and so on. And eventually a fungus will come in and colonize it. And there's a really big wound, much bigger than this in size. I assume it was a semi-trailer at Coffs Harbour, hit a Citriodora just as you leave the main section of Coffs Harbour heading south. And you can see the fungus growing on it. The tree's dealing with that fine at this stage. What really matters is how much new growth we get here. In other words, if in 10 years' time this is sitting along out here and it's 100 mils thick, the tree's probably going to do quite fine. If in 20 years' time it's here and it's 200 mils thick, it's got more than enough wall thickness to continue to grow and not have a problem. It doesn't matter if it's got a cavity then.
Yeah. The sterility is a good point. Thanks.
Again, please.
So your point on the sterility, how it's not a sterile environment when we're painting, is a good point. The reason I ask is I've had a number of clients ask me about painting, and what I've been explaining to them so far is that there's a breathability issue by we're sealing in that moisture, not letting the tree breathe. But it's good to have some other input that I can give to them, because when I explain to them that the tree needs to breathe, I don't know, it's either my age or they just don't think that's quite true.
Well, it's not sort of true because that tissue's dead, but it's if you were to
it's drying out more than breathing. That's the critical issue.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. The
It's
other thing
kind
that's
of
an
like
issue.
breathing, but not quite.
The other issue that happens with woundwood is we want woundwood to form as slowly as the tree wants to deal with optimally. when we put a wound dressing on, we accelerate wound closure. And that was why it was so popular. It looked really great. What happens when you do that is you get secondary splitting at the junction between at the margin of the wound. So you get this process called ram's horning will often occur. And that ram's horning will result in small cracks going out into the new tissue. And then we start the process of losing tissue and affecting transport and everything again. So there's really nothing to support the closing of wounds. Martin's just put up a link to a paper. Martin, do you know what the paper says in its summary?
Hi to everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, Martin.
Hi, sorry. Yes, it has a positive effect. Unfortunately, the research haven't continued. I don't know why. There is, there's a technical challenge, which is how to keep trichoderma on a cut for long enough time to, let's say, settle the wound with formulation. That's it. But it seems to
make any difference how soon after the wound's made, whether the trichoderma is effective?
I think that there was some kind of delay even. So try to search it. It's kind of interesting, really.
Yeah, look, Francis Schwarzer did a lot of work on trichoderma inoculum, and his end conclusion was you then needed to have trichoderma isolates that were appropriate for the environment that you're in. And the suggestion for that, I believe, was that we're better off just leaving dead branches and letting them accumulate up in the tree. That was far more productive in terms of trying to control and improve the microflora than trying to inoculate. Kyle, you've got your hand up. You've got something down in?
I was just going to suggest that the trichodermas had a lot of potential for probably multiple decades now. And that my understanding of Schwartz's work is that for trichoderma to be really successful, it really needs to have a specific species matched to the specific species of fungi.
Isolate, so it's actually a subspecies or a genetic coding. That's right. That was the conclusion of his work. And again, we might find in another 30 or 40 years' time a whole different thing. And I talked about, covering this wound with lanolin straight after it's being done. That's a very different thing than putting a wound dressing on, because we're not wanting it to close in from the side then. We're wanting the parenchyma in here to start producing new bark and new occluding, and it'll do that. So very different process. But of course, now that this is dead, I wouldn't touch this with lanolin. I think that would be horrendous, because it would make this grow faster than ever and almost guarantee to spread decay right through the new tissue. We want this new tissue to stay unaffected by decay. That's really important, because we're going to rely on this in another 20 or 30 years' time for strength.
Just on the ram's horns you mentioned earlier, Mark, when it closes too quickly, you're talking about the ram's horn when the two sides meet in the middle? No, that's again creates wound. Let me see if I can find your picture very quickly. Yeah, thank you. Okay. Here's our wound. Okay. And this is the secondary splitting that we're talking about. Right. This is okay, because coming in and it's occluding far too quickly. And we used to try and encourage this. Again, you can see here, this wanting to push things and then get secondary splitting. This is actually the point of the wound, and this is the spread of that wound upwards. So we want to try and avoid doing that where possible. And this, it's interesting enough, it opened it up. This is lanolin on the face of a wound, and you can see here with the woods growing back from the wound face itself.
This is after about 6 weeks of treatment. And you can see lots of little pockets here just getting ready to do the same thing. Okay, so there's the difference between a wound dressing where we're trying to get occlusion by using the actual tissue as opposed to coming in from the sides. There's what we expect is going to happen with that Angophrys perhaps over time, but that's quite strong tissue, particularly as it moves out. So no, I'm not worried about the hollow being there. It will eventually get there.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that. Yep.
That's fine. No, good questions. Excellent questions. If you ever get to the US and you get to see Shago's original sample collection, and it's actually, I think it's available online now. Davey's digitized it. That's worthwhile going and having a look at. Okay. Next one. This is a really fascinating one. This is a tree with a spiral on it. Who took this shot?
That's Graham again.
Graham. Do me a favor and send through a rough location so I can go have a look at this. But this tree is grown with a spiraling grain, and that's not uncommon. I don't know what's damaged it. I don't know what's hurt it. But all bar a small portion has died off, and it looks spectacular. I think that's amazing. And trees can survive like that for decades and decades. And that creates a problem. What do you say when you see something like that? Ignoring this large dead piece here and dead piece here, is there a high likelihood that this tree is going to fail?
No, it's pretty tough. It's on the side of the road on the way to the Awabba tip at Lake Macquarie. So I did send a Google pin with the email, which
I'll have a look at that later on. Yep, I see the Google pin there. That's great. Yeah, I look forward to seeing it at some stage. It's a neat looking tree. And there are lots of really wonderful trees. So trees, we think of trees as they should all be very much the same. But in fact, trees are very much like people. We just look at the variation in people online now. Rob is as skinny as a rake and me that's as round as a beach ball. Peter that's going bald, okay? And goodness knows there are people that are turning grey and they're only in their damn 40s. What's wrong with you there? So that's the same with trees. There's a lot of diversity within a species, huge amounts, so much so that people then select them. So, for example, weeping lily-pilly, Waterhousia floribunda, is now a number of cultivars as well because somebody's just picked a feature and gone and propagated for that feature. Tristaniopsis lorina, same thing. Someone had one with some really nice big glossy leaves, and boy, it becomes Tristaniopsis lorina luscious.
Or Granny Smith apple.
Yeah. Well, that's probably a pretty obvious difference. But even if we planted 100 trees and walked along the row of 100 trees of the same species, we would pick up there was differences within that. And in fact, a guy called Luther Burbank did that exact process in America. Often picked the potato for that, the Burbank potato, fruit trees on that basis, and that actually has a name or word usage in the US, Burbanking, and that's the process of going through, looking at a large number of things and trying to find the things that are different. And there are people still to this day that do exactly that. Go to wholesale nurseries, walk up and down rows one after another and say, I want that plant because of its uniqueness. And I have a friend who retired and he makes his money out of PBR stuff that's grown from stuff that his Burbanked as he's been going through nurseries. So neat little way of doing things. But that's a great little mistoma, is it, Graham?
Yeah, I think it is. I haven't actually checked properly.
Yeah,
but
I mean, it's one of those. It just looks like it might be from the scribble here. But again, you see hemostomas out in the natural environment where sometimes 70 and 80% of the circumference is gone. They've just got a thin shell, and they seem to survive like that for decades and decades and decades. So Here's another scar tree. Now, again, it's certainly been injured, and it's got these unusual markings here going up and down the trunk. Again, I'm assuming this is Newcastle.
Yeah, southern Lake Macquarie, Newcastle area.
Yeah. The Indigenous community didn't make dendricus, so we can eliminate that on that basis. We can eliminate it on the basis that the trunk diameter, I'm guessing 600-700 mils again.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, decent size eucalyptus terraticornis.
Yeah, so this is probably, and it'd be interesting to see if we can find any earlier shots. This is probably somewhere in the 60 to 70 year, maybe 80-year mark as a tree. This is modern axe mark. So somebody's come in and done something there, goodness knows why, or goodness knows what. And it may be that it's been indigenous and made to look like a leaf. I don't know. But you can see how much wound wood it's producing. And this is never going to be a problem for the tree. And it'd be interesting to watch, but I'm going to guess probably another 20 years. And all that you'll see is the seam from where that was. It'll have occluded completely. Rob.
Mark, here in the, shall we say, the highly developed parts of Australia, we have a kind of a reverence for the scar trees. And I'm wondering, what about people who live in, the Indigenous people who live in the more traditional tribal situation? What's their attitude?
Well, no, there's less. The reverence for them is that there's been a loss of connectivity to culture. And so this gives them some connectivity back to culture. The concern that I raised in that paper several years ago, 3 years ago, was that when we dilute down our culturally modified trees with trees that aren't culturally modified, they lose connectivity with their heritage because they don't truly understand what's involved and what's happened. And, so often the temptation is to say, look, it looks like a shield, it looks like a Coolamon, therefore that's probably what it was. But, the same thing at the side of the road formed by a Holden Commodore has the same shape. And that's because of the way that the vascular tissue has to go around a wound. It has to curve. It just doesn't go at right angles. And so I would say on the East Coast, probably 75% of the trees that have been, in inverted commas, set as scar trees. And I think Adam was making the comment, the ones outside Melbourne Cricket Ground, for example, really dubious. The real smart thing to do would be go out and carbon date them and become more accurate, but the likelihood that they're pre-1900s is pretty remote. Easter, anywhere you're getting reasonable rainfall, you've got reasonable water, along the Camargulensis, whilst we think of them as slow-growing trees, Camargulensis can put on 2+ centimetres of radius in a year. I mean, it's able to grow at amazing speed. So, if you're talking about closing a wound that's 30 centimetres across, 2 centimetres from each side, it doesn't take you long to get it to occlude completely. And so, if you've got an area where the Indigenous community had been displaced 100 years ago, and you're getting 5 mils a year, again, you would expect to see the wound. You'd expect not to see the wound in reality. But as I said, I don't know whether this was one that was made to look like a leaf by somebody. But what is great is that Graham's got these photographs, and he can go back in 10 or 20 years' time when he's old and decrepit and say, look, these trees are pretty well occluded, and I am amazed at the speed at which that can happen. again, my earlier assumptions were big trees, and there's an actual article, I've still got a copy of it in the archives, of me complaining about 200-year-old terracornis getting cut down, that now I'd happily agree were probably 60 to 80-year-old trees. But they, to me, were 200-year-old trees. As I see more and more, and certainly aerial images, our earlier aerial images have been really useful in saying, hey, no, these trees aren't that old. And certainly, we're talking about maybe a third of the radius of the tree in woundwood. So if that's 100 years there, then our tree must be 300 years old. Well, I know that's not a 300-year-old terracornis. I'm absolutely positive on that. It's a relatively young tree. Okay, great. Here's one from New Zealand from a guy called Gary Claxton, who says, okay, the tree in front of this person's house is blocking the view of the neighbour. The neighbour would like the tree to go. And he'd like the tree to go because it's blocking the view. So he says, look, this tree's dangerous. And obviously it's dangerous. Every tree's dangerous. I'm dangerous. Lock me up in jail tonight. And it's damaging some concrete. Must be damaging the concrete because there are cracks in the concrete. And if there's cracks in the concrete, it must be the tree roots. If there are no trees, then something else is causing it. But when there's a tree, only the tree can cause the damage. Of course, I'm being sarcastic. The reality is we have correlation and not causation. And society struggles with that big time. Here's an example from COVID-19. During COVID-19, people with walking frames were dying at a phenomenal rate. Therefore, walking frames were killing people. That's the causational argument from correlation. The fact that the two are happening was because old people use walking frames, and old people were more vulnerable to COVID-19, not to walking frames. So the court here in New South Wales has been very good on this. It said, show me the money. Open up that crack, find the roots, then do the calculations. The court has gone so far as to say it's not good enough just to say there's a root there, but therefore the roots cause the. Like, actually do some number crunching and demonstrate that that's a reasonable proposal. Particularly not so much with a driveway because it's a fairly light structure, but with a wall. And there's a really controversial decision that the LEC made, Land Environment Court made about 7 or 8 years ago, where there was a crack in the house wall that you could put your hand through, and the engineers couldn't demonstrate mathematically that you could put your that couldn't be caused by tree roots, and so they couldn't prove that it could be caused by tree roots, and the court dismissed it. Yes, Tim the Tree Man. I know it's not Tim because that's really misleading.
Jane the Tree Man didn't sound quite as good.
Sorry, what?
I guess what Jane the Tree Man didn't sound quite as good.
Jane the Tree Man sounds great, actually.
Wow. Only on Wednesdays. What I say to people is, how long have you lived in the house? Was the tree there when you purchased the house? Did you undertake a pre-purchase inspection before you purchased the house? Did you engage an arborist? I think it's very unfair and unreasonable to move into a dwelling and then look over the fence and complain about the neighbour's tree. It's unfair, it's unreasonable. You didn't do your due diligence, and it's just basic bad manners.
Yeah, but perhaps that's an argument. My argument is that almost always when someone's complaining about a tree, a neighbour's tree, I go to their place and they don't have a tree. And the problem they don't have trees, if you had it's like the people that complain about dogs barking are people that don't have dogs that bark.
Yes.
If everyone had trees that were dropping leaves and causing some nuisance, we'd all shut up about it. And what we've got now is a society with people that have trees and love them, and then people that move in beside them that hate them. And I find that's the hard bit. And in this case, this is a tree owner's driveway. The tree owner doesn't give a damn. So the tree's staying. and that's just the way it goes. Now, there are purchasers that will not purchase that property because there's a tree in the way.
Correct.
There are purchasers that will purchase that property because there are trees in the way.
But how old's that
And-
driveway? Is it fair and reasonable to think that a driveway that age may likely crack? Like, when was the house built? How was it engineered? Has it got Rio in it? You know, there's
Yeah,
all
that's
those
right.
questions.
This is a very light structure that's easy to crack. Give me a bobcat, and a bobcat and a human being with the right leverage equipment can do about the same damage, and same with a root.
Yes.
You know, if there's a 4-inch concrete driveway with very little Rio or lightweight Rio, if this hadn't been properly compacted beforehand, all sorts of things. And one of the things that's important to keep in mind, we don't think about this, but concrete is a crystalline structure, and when it forms, it already forms with microfractures in it. That means from day one, it's already got cracks. You know, and so it is vulnerable all the same. The way we deal with that is we put lots of Rio in it to keep the tensile strength good. So we don't have sufficient Rio, we don't have sufficient concrete, we get things that crack. And I'm here with an office that's got a 6-inch floor in it, and it got cracks during the drying process. You know, to think that you don't get cracks in concrete, and there is a standard that deals with this. There's an engineering standard that deals with this, and this doesn't affect the function of the driveway at all.
No.
Just an aesthetic issue. And you know, you raise the issue of age. The older you get, the more problems you get. My advice, and Kyle will agree with me, whatever you do, don't get older. That's the best advice, isn't it, Peter? Your mic's off.
Yeah, look, I think it's a problem getting older, but it's better than the alternative.
Yeah.
Dust.
And that's the issue here. This is an old driveway, and the alternative is suck it up and replace it.
Yeah.
Exactly. If you don't want to suck it up and replace it, there's just a few cracks. Get on with life. It's not like it's the end of the world. Many years ago, in my youth, I lived in a house called Melrose. It's a government-owned property that's a heritage property. And the master bedroom had a crack in the wall that you could put your arm through. They put a false wall in to conceal it. And that's still there. The crack's still there. It's a part of heritage. You know, nobody's going to go out and say, oh, you know, well, we'll have to knock down the house. We just cosmetically cover it up. And I guess if they wanted to, they could cosmetically cover this up. But, you know, I don't know that I'd bother.
I think it's our job to educate them and just say, get an arborist in every 12 to 18 months, get the tree assessed. And if there's no changes and there's limited targets, you just got to manage the risk. It's more dangerous getting in a car every day, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's actually more dangerous to remove the tree. We do two things. We defer the risk to the guys doing tree work.
Yes.
And the second thing is we take away all the health benefits from those trees. And so almost always, if the tree is healthy and not actively failing, we do more harm by getting rid of it than we do by keeping it.
Right.
I can't remember a young fellow that sent me this one, Peter. I don't think of his name. Keller's his surname, anyhow.
I can't remember either, sorry. I'd have to look it up.
Send some images through of showing some of the cabling and bracing that he's doing. And there is a international standard on cabling and bracing. It's worthwhile having a look at. But there's something that I really like about this, a number of things. First of all, hasn't tried to make his wound here any bigger than it needs to be. He's finished off his thing, he's burred over the edge here. And then I love this, he's put a marker date on it so that a person's got an idea of the age of that system and when it was installed. I would prefer this wages because I'm just old-fashioned, but it's neat seeing good quality. This is a young kid, could be in his 20s or 30s, going ahead doing some really neat bracing work. And again, not sure that I want to do a hell of a lot of bracing, particularly static bracing, but if you're going to do it, it's done well. I'll give him that. This looks like an oak. I'm almost positive it's an oak. I'm just forever amazed at how good they are at just continuing on in life. But it's neat work, and particularly done at tree. And as I said, the great thing is the dating with the system that's easily identifiable and visible. And hopefully he's smart enough to have figured out that he needs to change the colour of this each year. So from the ground, if you're in his team or you know who he is, you can determine the age of the brace just visually with a good camera or binoculars. So good stuff. Okay, any questions from the floor, guys? I'll entertain them for up to half an hour, and then that's
just on the
Yes,
on the
Chris.
bracing. What do you think about the steel cable as opposed to synthetic?
both got their place. I have a preference for dynamic because I have this belief that trees are biologically clever. I don't think I can say that they're clever in the human sense of clever, but biochemically they do some amazing things. And I think I've showed you before, and I certainly can pull one up now, what a transverse fracture looks like. And that's a horrible thing for a tree to get. But trees can pull themselves back together and stitch themselves back together. One day Google will be as smart as me.
Unknown caller.
Yeah. So here's one. So this cracked on the top side of the branch all the way to the outside edge. You can see the crack. Yeah. Tree stitched it back together, put new tissue on the outside, made itself stronger. So I'm really reluctant to do things that affect the natural systems. So my preference is dynamic bracing rather than static bracing. But I'm not going to argue and say that static bracing is wrong. It's another choice and another option, and there's some advantages to it over dynamic. One of the things that you will get, Rob, is greater strength out of a static brace area-wise by a long way. You can put an M20 bolt through, you can put an M20 cable and an N20 Amon nut, and that thing's good for tons and tons and tons. I can only get an 8-ton maximum, and if I do a 4-to-1, that's only a 2-ton load using a dynamic system. So there are limits to the dynamic system, but I prefer dynamic. Answer that question, Chris.
Just to change the subject, I've got a brachychiton that I want to cut a couple of roots on. I'm just trying to, have you got any papers? I know they can be transplanted and cut 3-5 times, sometimes even 2 times trunk diameter. Is there any references out there that I can find supporting that?
Species?
Brachychiton, the Couragong populensis.
Very tolerant of being cut. No, I don't know that there is. They do, or they can be really susceptible to a weevil that attacks the xylem. And you've got to watch for that. It's one of the problems with brachychiton rupestris transplants. Once the weevil gets in, weevils often introduce fungi, and the whole thing goes to pieces fairly quickly. Brachychitons have lots of living tissue, lots of parenchyma, so they're good at resisting decay, but when decay gets going, it bounces the hell out of them. They also have a cordex, that is, they have a taproot that goes down, often quite substantial. So often the lateral roots are less critical. So if you're talking about cutting something that's 5 centimeters in diameter, I wouldn't have a panic about it, but I don't know that anyone's researched it.
Yeah, it's It's a couple of 10 centimetre roots laterally, about 2 metres from the stem.
Yeah, I wouldn't have problems with that.
Yeah, I just think council might, but hopefully I can argue the case.
Look, again, it's interesting. There is a root loss calculator that we developed, made comments. I don't know whether there's a link anywhere in the system, Peter, that you've got from.
I think so. I think I put it up.
Okay, so you can go through and put that information in. Brachychitons are a bit of an aberrance because they've got this, because they're a caduciform tree, they've got this big bulbous base, and so the trunk diameter is really not representative. Well, let me ask you a question. What happens when a wombat goes through and does the same damage to that 10 centimetre root? So wombat will.
Nothing.
Yeah. Having said that, I do recall, and I won't mention the council out of respect, but I had a 75 centimetre jacaranda, and the council said, you want to cut a 65 millimetre diameter root? No, we can't do that. It's in the structural root zone. The tree might fall over. And the only thing that almost fell over was me and laughter, because I've seen 300 and 400 mil diameter roots cut on jacarandas and them just saying, well, that wasn't nice, and keep on going. So 65 millimeters was really quite small. It represented about 3% of the tree's biomass, root biomass. So if a fire had gone through and burnt the base of the tree, we'd have had a 1/3 opening and a 1/3 scar, and would have said, oh yeah, the tree's still okay. All that roots on that 1/3 will have gone. We'll still say, oh, the tree's okay, but somehow or other magically cutting a 65 millimetre root would cause the tree to fall over. It's illogical. But we are still an industry that uses a lot of anecdotal evidence, a lot of emotional evidence, and it's hard to deal with, particularly if you're dealing with somebody that, and a good and fair question to ask Chris in that situation is to ask the other side, how many trees have you dealt with that are like this, where you've done that and you've had something go wrong? And I had an experience in the Land Environment Court a few years ago where the other side, yes, said, look, I've had some major incursions. And the next question the barrister asked was, have you ever been back to the site to inspect to see how they're going? The honest answer was no. And I thought, how do you make any decision at all, anecdotally or empirically, based on never having done anything? And the answer was, well, that's what I was taught. And that's what I was taught is a really, really dangerous way to go. We've got to have research. We've got to have papers. We've got to have some common sense and logic brought in. Andy.
Mark, is there any paper available that talks about the tolerance of native tree species to root pruning?
Look, there have been several attempts to give lists, but I think the real one that I like to give as an example, and you may or may not have seen these before, GORGIAEUROPE. Why would you have a place name the same place as a state? Is this here? This here is a eucalyptus. And this here is a man from there to there. That's the mower in front of him, that green bit there, all the way up to here. These are all eucalyptus transplants. I'm guessing eucalypts are relatively tolerant of root damage. And yet the number of times I've been told they aren't is just huge. My first experience was informing a guy in Reno, Nevada. He came from Hawaii, a guy called Steve Nims. He said, you want to buy a tree spade? And I said, yes. He said, what are you going to move? I said, oaks and deciduous trees and palms. He said, how about eucalypts? And I said, you can't move eucalypts. He said, boy, I wish I'd met you a few years ago. I said, why? He said, well, we've just finished moving 2,500. When will they start to die? I thought, oh, okay, I've just been done. And so we have this belief. Now, it's interesting. a few years ago, I had the pleasure of working in Carmel for a very wealthy property developer and movie star. And the company I was working for said, "Oh, Mark, we've got real problems. We're going to be moving live oaks in Carmel. And, if it goes wrong, we're going to have bad publicity and you can't move live oaks." And I said, "Well, why not? They run anatomically the same. There's nothing strange or unusual or really freaky about the way that the trees work. So why can't we do it? We just have to put the same effort and take the same care that you would normally." And indeed, all those trees survived and did really well. So I think a lot of it is how we feel about things affects it. And a good example of that's palm transplants. Brochette suggests that trunk diameter plus 30 centimeters is what you'd ideally like for a transplant, as a minimum. You get people move Phoenix robellini and they want to move it with a 30 centimeter total root plate. Well, that's just inadequate. Yes, but it's only a small palm and it's insignificant. Yes, but that's not what the equation says. And I think there's a lot of that happens when we don't value a thing. And again, a good experience. Many years ago, I had a young guy, not young anymore, Dan Thomas, will see this at some stage. Dan's an arborist down in Melbourne now. And we're working on some trees. He said, "You can't move English oaks. They're just absolutely useless to move." And I thought, isn't that funny? Because they're the common tree for them, can't be done. Same with acacias. My first experience of moving acacia pubescens, the environmental consultant on the site said, "Look, we get 3% success rate moving them. They're very hard." And I said, "I just don't understand." So we got 103% success rate. We actually ended up with suckers growing back and had more than we started the process with. And I was always taught that acacias can't be moved. So I'm not sure what can't, but one of the questions you could ask, and is Adam Tom, when he's on again as a mentor, he's been on, has he been on yet, Peter? Don't think so. Adam.
No, he hasn't. He hasn't been all that well lately. So.
Yeah. No, I've been aware. We keep on coming up with these trees that we think are going to be difficult, and again, you take appropriate care, appropriate preparation and aftercare, and they seem to be successful. What's really fascinating about this, more than anything else, is that these trees were moved by a guy who's not an arborist. He had some arborist consulting to him, and he did some things that, I might not necessarily appreciate it in terms of breaches of patents and things like that. But he's a builder, not an arborist. It's amazing that here we've got a builder saying, "I know more about trees than you do." And this is just exquisite in my mind. This is, a good opening, a thin wall. We'd all be saying, "Yep, it's okay to get it cut down. Yeah, or, it's not ideal." And he's saying, "Cut it down. This is the very feature we want it for. Stuff cutting it down. Let's spend a few $100,000 moving it." In fairness, that's the guy's house. Okay. It's not bad. It's 8 stories to here. It gives you an idea. So spending a few dollars moving a few trees is not a big issue. Next question. Or does that answer your question, Andy? Do you want to?
Yeah, that's a pretty good start, Mark. Thank you.
My gut level feeling is at 5 times we probably don't have too many issues at all. At 3 times we start to get close to the mark of having some issues.
Yeah, I'd like to see some table of sensitivity perhaps in the future, but for my local speakers anyway, because I'm often confronted with that choice.
One of the ways to do it is to go out and find things where people do things wrong and they're all over the place, and then say, how did that go? Did it work? Was it successful? And I'm forever amazed at how many times I look at things and think, okay, well, I got that wrong. The trees are incredibly tiny. It's seldom an action of cutting some roots that kills a tree. It's usually a series of things that are done. You know, long-term neglect, wash out with your cement trucks, run over the root plates, do a whole pile of vile and horrible things, and that results in your tree having issues, not just a one-up event. I was just seeing if I can quickly find a site that I rocked up to that I was absolutely gobsmacked at, and you know, they cut 1 times trunk diameter away from the base of the trees, and I thought, you know, blimey, that's not going to survive long. And it just turned out that the tree did perfectly fine and had no issues at all. So not saying that's going to happen every time, but it happens certainly with 2 of the 3 trees. And I think, you know, when you start taking 50% of the roots off or thereabouts, you really are pushing the limits on the process. Dominic.
Yeah, I haven't actually heard anyone specify, but when people are saying, when it comes to transplanting, you know, as you said earlier, 5 times the trunk diameter, you're saying 5 times trunk diameter as a radius from the tree, not diameter overall.
So the biggest trees in the world are typically done 5 to 6 times trunk diameter. Some of them drop down depending on the species to as low as 3 times trunk diameter.
But that's trunk diameter distance as a radius?
Yes, as a radius, yeah.
Yeah, just wanted to double check on that because I've never actually heard anyone specify whether that's a radius or a total diameter measurement. That's all.
Yeah, no, that's a radius, so 5 times radius. And if you look at that, that's 25 over the Australian standard, 144. That's, you know, less than 80%. Now, I do concede, and we need to be clear that there's some things that happen when you're transplanting that may not happen on a construction site. First of all, we're putting it back usually into site soils. There'll often be some irrigation put on, and I've said it dozens of times, and I'll keep on saying it. If I can get a developer to irrigate periodically during dry periods on a development site, that hides hundreds of sins, really does. The reason it does that is the part of the root system that absorbs water is stimulated by water. Makes good sense.
So can you say that last little bit again? I didn't quite catch it.
The part of roots that absorbs water is stimulated water. They're absorbing roots, or the zone of maturation where it's got root hairs. That's where the vast percentage of water uptake is done. I'll just pull up a picture if I can of an absorbing root. I think there should be some in the collection. Maybe not. Oh, yeah, that's a horrible shot, though. I'll do the horrible thing and ask Google to find me all my root shots, and there'll be hundreds and hundreds of things that gets wrong. Roots, Canberra, maybe. No, these are all woody roots, is the bottom line. So these have all had the bark blown off, and this is the problem with hydrovacking. That's just destroy them.
I supervised a job with another arborist 2 years ago. A beautiful plane tree, brought in a hydrovacking, and I actually said to everyone, that's too high pressure, we're blowing the bark off, and the other arborist said, oh, that'll be okay.
Yeah.
And they're thinking, sure. I'm not the lead, but sure.
People again, aren't necessarily aware of how root systems work. If there's a common theme I see worldwide, is that arborists don't have their head around how a root system works. We've got our head around photosynthesis fairly well, sunlight, carbon dioxide, gaseous exchange, some magical chemical process that ends up with glucose at the end. We've got that. But water and roots is a very different end of the world. And that's because we don't see it as easily. We don't get to play with it. It's not as intuitive, but it is really a wonderfully elegant, beautiful process. And if you ever get to come to an anatomy workshop, our very first practical is looking at the difference between the two and how they work. I'll just try root hairs, just out of curiosity.
Just on that, are you running your anatomy workshop at the Arboriculture conference next year?
Believe I am. I believe I haven't burned all my bridges on that yet, although I've been trying to. Here's a good example. These are root hairs. This is a willow root. From there, that's the zone of elongation, so it's still getting longer.
Yeah.
This is a zone of maturation. Come down to here, and this area was just a little bit more moist, and it encouraged a little bit more absorbing root development. These root hairs just increase the surface area remarkably. So that's their importance. Woody root, these are no longer functioning root hairs, they're just dead root hairs, but they were important when the root was younger. And roots tell us a whole pile of stories about trees, just as the above ground bits. You can see roots that are dehydrating. Well, I've got a soil moisture problem. How old is it? It's been dehydrating for a while. I've got some new roots forming now. Okay, we've had a rain event recently. The roots are overall in good health. The roots are sloughing off and everything's slimy. Oh, we've got Phytophthora. So definitely an important process to get to understand. And, not that that's a good shot by any stretch of the imagination. That's a proteoid root on a plant that I went to plant in the garden, and I pulled the pot off and looked and saw the proteoid root and said, how amazing, there it is, just sitting as a cluster. And so there's a more in clusters. Again, we're not going to deal with every permeation of how these things work, but we need to have some idea of the basics of them. Yep. And because these things, going back to our earlier one here in the willow, because these things are highly ephemeral, they come and go very quickly, we need to understand that. I can regenerate the absorbing root system of a tree in 6 or 8 weeks. That's it.
Yeah, don't deciduous trees shed and regrow their absorbing roots each season?
Each year they reduce the number of absorbing roots right back down because they don't have much absorption to do during the middle of winter, although they can do some small amounts. That was a horrible experiment of digging through snow with Alex Shogo saying, go find them. In terms of evergreen trees, they're constantly doing, as the root matures, it no longer absorbs. The root that was elongating, the bit that's getting longer, these younger things, these are simply pioneering or pushing into some new areas. Yep. And then they start to do this. Then they get older, and as they get older still, then they become woody. So every single root has to start its life as a root cap pushing through with some pioneer, and then that zone of maturation, or that absorbing zone where it takes in water. And so you can cut a large portion of roots off a eucalypt and have it regenerate. I know that because I've seen it done, and we've all done it at some stage or other. We've pulled an evergreen tree out of the ground, a young sapling, and put it into a pot, a seedling that's 200-300 mils high. We're stripping off all those roots, and yet amazing, we put it into some potting mix and keep it moist for a few weeks, and off it goes again. And we might have taken 80 or 90% of the roots of the absorbing capacity. The absorbing roots are highly ephemeral. Okay, so water absorption and growth above ground, the photosynthetic part of it, highly interconnected with each other. If you've got the above ground portion flushing, you've got roots growing. If you've got roots growing, you're going to get the above ground portion of the tree flushing.
When you say ephemeral, Mark, how long are we talking? I know that different trees and different conditions are different, but
weeks, not months.
Yeah.
Okay. Mycorrhizal roots, so that's a really different deal again. A year or 2 maximum. Okay, and that because that's an elegant efficiency, That's a part of why that system works that way, where the fungus does the hard work of getting in water and solutes and transferring that to the tree, and the tree does the job of giving some excess photosynthates back to the fungi. It's a truly mutualistic symbiosis or beneficial symbiosis. But yeah, something like this, and these are unusual. Again, this is grown, Peter. This came from our agronomy breeding boxes, and they're kept nice and humid. They're kept nice and dark, and roots grow unbelievably well in that sort of environment versus the average soil in Australia, which the biggest chemical shortage that we have. And no, you're not going to get a chance to do a promotional talk, Martin. But the biggest problem we have in Australia is low soil moisture levels. It's our big limiting chemical. It's not nitrogen. It's not phosphorus. It's water. We're not like parts of Europe where it rains 9 months of the year fairly consistently. We go through dry periods and heats. And what's it like in Melbourne at the moment, Rob? 35, 36 degrees still?
No, it's been a very strange day. We've had the whole city shrouded in fog, and the fog never lifted the whole day.
Oh, really? That's weird. After yesterday's heat wave.
Yeah.
Yes, Martin, hands up.
Hi, I just wanted to know that I provide you a link to a chat to my and Lindsay Nielsen from Utah Botanical Garden presentation, which we gave in at a ISA conference in Atlanta this year. And we discussed different methods of watering of mature trees, especially raised the problem of shallow rooting. Yes, I sent my article to Peter yesterday, and I sent you, Mark, my article today via email. Because we noted also a very interesting point on cooling of cities of trees in the cities, which can be probably used now where you're facing these heat waves. So yes, I just wanted to invite you to download the presentation handout. It's a kind of very interesting stuff. It was a very appreciated presentation at the conference. So maybe for your for your knowledge and thinking.
Yeah, and look, we as I said, I'm not going to let you do the advert, but water is so important, and where you've got big mature trees like we do have, and your research shows this, Martin, just a small input, a few thousand litres for that tree can have a significant impact on the longer term performance. And so when you're looking at a tree on a development site and you're cutting off roots, you're essentially forcing it into that drought situation. And so adding water is a really important component, in my view, of maintaining trees on development sites. And it's one that's so hard to get the developer to buy into, to say, yes, I'm going to put an irrigation system on, I'm going to operate it. And I won't mention the builder, although they're great. And the site foreman is just sometimes not the brightest when it comes to trees. But his one lovely phrase that I hear every time I see him is, I put the water on this week, Mark. And I think, yep, okay, we're getting on top of this site. He always pushes the fence closer than he should. He digs and does things that he shouldn't do. And, we're looking at projects 10 and 12 years later where the trees are still looking great, simply by regenerating this system in closer. And again, it shouldn't surprise us, because if you go to Europe in particular, and the northern parts of the US, bare root nursery stock is commonplace. What's the limit? What's the absolute maximum size you can do for a bare root transplant, do you think? Anyone?
But you mean as in mature tree
How big a
size?
trunk? Yeah, how big a trunk? I mean, we see them come in pots that you put in the ground.
I'm guessing
Yeah,
it's pretty big.
They move things around the world that are meterage in diameter, meter plus. I don't have one that I can pull very quickly, but Asia in particular, just really hammer and do these things called trunk transplants. Just a trunk and a small amount of roots, and the dirt's there because it's just too hard to get off, and that's it. And off they go, rebuild a whole tree. And I've been to one of those trees that was moved like that in Thailand. Took a day to travel there, and it's only 2,000 years old. So I guess transplanting it that way is going to have an effect on its life. It'll eventually die, and will show you that doing that is bad for a tree. Well, if I can get 2,000 years out of a tree, I'm not too upset about it. And if you look at and I know I can find this one online, if you look at the Buckland Yew, which is William Barron.
Just with that trunk transplant, Mark, did you say they did a bare root transplant with that tree trunk, or with that with soil as well?
They get some soil because it's just too hard to take the soil off, but it just shows you how little you need. And this image here is a great example. And let me see if I can open image in a new tab. Yep. It's really pixelated, and I apologize for that. This is 1880. My next image of it's 1907. I bought a photograph of it then. But this is a 1,200-year-old yew tree. It's about 2 meters across there, and this is about 5 and a bit meters across total. Pretty small. Now, I know that 1,200 years, it's only a young tree. And that was moved 140 something rather years ago. I'm guessing it's going to die eventually, but all it's done so far is had one limb get overweight and break. Not an ideal way to treat a tree, but it just shows you what you can do. And I really am not suggesting we treat every tree like crap. But one of the things that I worry about as arborists is we say, look, no, that tree can't be retained. It's going to be too hard. We don't try. We don't fail. If we're doing good tree protection work, occasionally we'll get a failure. Now, having said that, I almost never see a failure. It's just such a rarity because I think we're already preserving huge amounts of material, a lot more than we need, particularly if we give just a modicum of aftercare. Yes, Dominic.
Just on the topic of tree root watering, it just reminded me of something that I always ask myself to ask at these meetings when I'm writing a tree management plan. I bought the growing media for ornamental plants and turfs at the recommendation of a horticulturalist, because that's apparently their go-to textbook.
Yep.
And I read the section on about calculating how to calculate how much water to give a plant. I was wondering what tools you guys use to try and calculate how much water, especially when it's protecting a tree during a development work. How do you guys estimate how much water to give the tree on a fortnightly, monthly basis?
I look at it by irrigation shortfall and what the tree will tolerate. So I live in Sydney, and I do a lot of work on what's called the Cumberland Plains, and they're heavy clays that reach saturation periodically. So saturation is not necessarily a huge problem. I don't want to be sitting at saturation, so I want to try and avoid saturation, and I want to find what's called the Goldilocks zone. The Goldilocks zone is not too wet, not too dry, just right. And that's going to vary from species to species, soil type to soil type. I have to say, and it's really odd, I still use a digital moisture meter, these ones. Okay. The human fingers and the human lip are really good. Jan, you can switch off now and I'll get into trouble for it. But most of you in the house somewhere, there's a room with 2 white machines in it. And one of those you can put clothing in. When you pull it out, you can put that clothing to your lip and you can feel whether it's dry or wet straight away. You grab it and you feel whether it's wet. You feel that it's dryish, but you can't get any water out of it. So you already know about soil if you do washing.
Yeah.
Okay, so I encourage you to do washing. And then when you put it in the dryer, if you've got one of those dryers like we have that's got all these sensitive things that sense the amount of condensation and everything else, every now it'll come out and I think to myself, I can feel that. They're still slightly damp. Well, that would be wilt point or close enough for your tree. Okay. The spin cycle doesn't work. The pipe's kinked up and you've got to pull all the clothes out and it's all sloppy. That's saturation. And so, again, I think if you just get into a habit of doing 1 or 2 loads of washing a month, your love life will improve and you'll also learn how to deal with soils better.
Look, I've been doing my washing for, I know, 12 years now.
No, it's exactly the same. I hate to say
Oh,
it.
no, that's all right. Because what I've been writing in my tree management plan so far, and this is kind of like, look, to be honest, it's kind of me guessing, but I've been specifying something along the lines of, 50% field capacity once a fortnight or however many weeks. But the issue is, how on earth is a builder going to know what 50% field capacity is?
You can buy really cheap, reliable, calibratable tensiometers for about $200 something or other dollars if it's an important site. That's an option. But just thinking about your rainfall. So I think here my average rainfall is about 18 mils a week. We're winter Mediterranean climate, so we have a high rainfall winter. Summer is dry and hot. So I can probably get a little bit more water in during that summer period, remembering that water's the limiting factor. If I take olives and I grow them in ideal conditions, they grow like weeds at phenomenal rates. So I can probably increase that moisture up. And yeah, somewhere between 70 and 80% is probably the irrigation point that I'd want to hit and then want it to dry out. So transplanting wise, it's a different deal again. Transplanting, you're probably going to want, every day or every second day whilst new roots are getting established. And then the problem with transplanting or when you're doing heavy root pruning, so same principle applies, is the soil volume you have is reduced and all the roots are taking the solutes from that same soil volume. So there may be a need to supplement. And my first preference for supplementing to get perfect tree growth is to give the tree a tree. Everything that a tree needs to be a tree is found in a tree. Mince that tree up, put it through the chipper, put it underneath the tree, give it some water, and you've got 50 to 60% of the job done. And
that's putting. So before you put the tree in, put a layer of mulch at the bottom of the hole, and then put the tree on it.
No.
What did you mean?
Once the tree is in, so you don't want to try and match soil to soil. If you've got clay, you're putting your tree in clay, the mulch goes on the top and the microorganisms break it down. The water picks it up. Most of the things that the microorganisms break it down are very water soluble or they're transported by the mycorrhizae and things like that. So the phosphates, for example, in the wood are converted into from phosphorus into phosphates, transported to the tree, and the exchange goes on. So a really good, in inverted commas, fertilizer to give a tree is a tree.
I thought mulch on top. It just for a moment there.
Yeah, no, I apologize.
I thought you meant put mulch underneath.
No, look, mulch underneath does this, and I've seen it in specifications. Mulch underneath produces anoxia. You produce anaerobic conditions, methane, sulfur dioxide. You kill the roots, you kill the tree. And I've seen people say, oh, just put some cow manure underneath it. Likewise, creating a textural barrier. So putting gravel underneath a tree when you're planting it, not a good move. You want it to be as close to what you've got. So if you're planting a 400-litre tree that's grown in potting mix, which is not uncommon because land's expensive in Australia, so lots of things are grown in containers rather than in ground. you want to dig a big hole, and then you want to try and mix the two and create a meld of soil between a coarse high draining material and the site soils, which might be a clay or a clay loam or whatever it might be, depending on where you are. That's the perfect situation. Hard to do. And so often we just plant and hope for the best.
Yeah, I appreciate all that. Thank you.
That's okay. Matthew, I'll get you to ask, and I'll have it as the last question for tonight, and we'll call it quits.
Yep. With those large container grown trees, is it worth ever then bare rooting them to transplant them so they're going straight into the natural soil?
Yeah, if you can get the potting mix out of that tree, you're doing a better job than me, because usually it's so tightly compact because we're getting the roots to die back start, and so they're very dense with roots. But yes, in theory, if you were planting something like that into clay soil, that's one option. Another one is to tear them out laterally and mound your soil slightly. You want to try and get away from the hole. The problem with the hole is you dig a hole in clay soils and it rains, it's just going to fill up. Now, it's okay if you're doing a street planting in a new subdivision where you can drain into the stormwater. That's great. But if you can't do that, they just want to become ponds. And I remember my first Christmas here at Shane's Park, going and finding in the front yard a beautiful Magnolia grandiflora for my wife, 200 mil diameter trunk, and then it rained. And then it rained, and then it rained, and it rained, and I couldn't get enough water out of the root plate, and it just died. The next one we put in a container that was 600 mils above ground. So we built a wall around it and had it half in and half out. Then we moved that tree again a second time about 4 or 5 years later, and we still have that tree. That's a variegated white cedar, Melia Zedrac Lady Gwenda, beautiful tree. Soils are a whole problem in themselves, and it's because water and soil do not often behave the way that we envisage it would happen. So, for example, putting that gravel layer underneath the clay root ball doesn't let the water drain into the gravel. It stops the water from coming out of the bottom of the root ball and starts to fill up. So you get a saturated zone in your root ball. If you've got a 500 mil root ball, you can lose very quickly, 200 or 300 mils out of it. And you're really getting a very small volume. Going out, and there's some really good videos, educational videos on this that'll help you understand that water doesn't behave what you think it would. And maybe that's something we can look at one of our evenings together.